I do want to go ahead and bring in our guest. His name is Keith McHenry. He is the founder of Food Not Bombs movement, and he has some things to say about USAID. So we're going to talk about that story. Let's go ahead and bring him in. Welcome, Keith. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's beautiful. I watch your show all the time. I'm so excited.
Well, I'm so excited to finally have you on. I know, I've been meaning to bring you on, and it's been crazy busy around here. So I'm glad to finally talk to you in person. First and foremost, before we get into USAID, could you tell everybody a little bit about Food Not Bombs?
Yeah, so Food Not Bombs started in Boston in 1980. And we were a theater group influenced by the Living Theater. And so we were saying that Reagan gets into power, there are going to be homeless people in America, because when we started, there was very few. So what we do is we collect food that can't be sold from grocery stores and bakeries, and in the case of Boston, from the Haymarket. And then we make that into vegan and vegetarian meals that we share on the streets. And we're active currently probably about 1,500 cities in the world. We're in 65 countries. It's an all-volunteer movement, and we have 3 principles. The food is always free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober, and it's always vegan and vegetarian. That there are no leaders. We're a worldwide decentralized movement. I'm a co-founder, but don't really have necessarily any influence on the direction, except for my local chapter here in Santa Cruz. And then we are not a charity, but we're dedicated to taking nonviolent direct action to change society so no one has to eat at a Food Not Bombs or at a soup kitchen or live in the streets. And so that's the Food Not Bombs in a nutshell.
That is awesome. We really are passionate about mutual aid over at RBN. So always good to hear about other things that are happening within the community, so people aren't just relying on electoral politics. But speaking of electoral politics, there is this big controversy about USAID. It seems as though chaos has been unleashed. Donald Trump and Elon Musk are making moves. Actually, Donald Trump is doing exactly what he said he was going to do, right? Which is he was going to gut the federal government. And that doesn't end with USAID. So I want to start with this clip here, and then I want to get to something that you posted on X as well. This is Chris Murphy. He's a senator from Connecticut. And I want people to hear his arguments against cutting USAID. I thought this was pretty funny because he says the quiet part out loud.
USAID fights terrorist groups all across this world, making sure that we address the underlying causes for a retreat to terrorism. USAID chases China all around the world, making sure that China doesn't monopolize contracts for critical minerals and port infrastructure all around the world. It supports freedom fighters everywhere in this world. Up until yesterday, delivering firewood, for instance, to the brave Ukrainian defenders on the Eastern Front.
So to make a long story short, I think Chris Murphy makes it very clear that USAID is very much involved in foreign policy, overthrowing governments. And I think a lot of Americans think that USAID is just a humanitarian organization. That's actually not just what it is. In fact, you posted this, and I want to give you a chance to talk about this because this was pretty shocking to me. I forget what I have it. I'm so sorry, Keith. But you posted that someone posted a tweet about basically USAID being a sort of CIA front. And you responded to that tweet and you said something about the drug game, right? Like they said something about why is USAID funding heroin production? And you responded to that. And I want to give you a chance to talk about what you know about this.
Well, I've written a lot on Twitter about the USAID in the last couple of days, so I'm not totally sure what I'd said, but I'll tell you what I know about the issue, and this is probably the tweet you're referring to. So my grandfather was in the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services in World War II. And he was involved in helping plan, Pearl Harbor. He was real involved in that, and said we needed to do Pearl Harbor so that the American people would get involved in the war in the Pacific. He also, while in Burma, he led the most deadly bombing campaign in world history, which is called Operation Meeting House, and he firebombed Tokyo. And Daniel Ellsberg, for instance, in his book, writes about that as being the most deadly bombing campaign in world history, and it still, fortunately, is true. Even though there's a lot of horrible bombing campaigns. But the other job that he had was to distribute heroin to the Black community in the United States, specifically to quell any possibility of rioting as a result of the fact that the GI Bill would be two-tiered. There'd be one for white people and one for Black people, and they're very concerned Black people would feel, since they were dying in the same trenches and in the same ocean as white people, that there would be an uprising. So his strategy, and the strategy of his friends, was to distribute massive amounts of heroin to Black America to make sure they were busy doing that instead of resisting this unequal treatment by the GI Bill.
Wow. So this kind of reminds me, was this during the time of Frank, I forget his last name. I'm sorry. You know, I'm talking about Frank, American Gangster. Denzel Washington played him. Frank Lucas. Was this around the same time?
Well, I don't know the time of that. This is in World War II. So he's starting to distribute the heroin out of Burma during World War II because they knew that the GI Bill would be passed and they needed to subvert. They already knew that the Dixiecrats wouldn't vote for equal GI Bill for Blacks and whites, and so on. So in preparation of towards the end of the war, they started setting up this heroin network. They also were financing other covert activities with the heroin. For instance, they were using the profits from the heroin to do like terrorist attacks in Italy primarily, and to help fund like the killing of the left, the partisans, after World War II. So there's a lot of what he specifically told me was that the concern of the need to suppress Black America because of this unequal treatment in the GI Bill. But so at that time, his friend, Robert McNamara, who was at the time Secretary of Defense, or would be Secretary of Defense later, he was a general at the time, and he was also very close to General Curtis LeMay. And I used to watch them. My grandfather in Massachusetts, and he would be on the phone arguing with them to drop the atomic bomb on Manhattan. This is at the same time Curtis LeMay was trying to convince John F. Kennedy to bomb a mall in Miami to justify an invasion of Cuba. So I grew up. He passed away when I was 14. I spent a lot of time. In fact, I spent the last summer before high school with him, going to Needham High to catch up on classes, and he was very clear about a number of things. One of them is that elections were intentionally created to divide and conquer, so there wouldn't be like unity against the ruling class. He made that very clear, and he explained that that presidents and political leaders are put into power by the intelligence community. They manipulate events. You can see that with the Hunter Biden laptop story that to get Biden in. You can see that with the Iran-Contra, right? To get Reagan in. This is how it works. So we don't live in a democracy. He made that very clear. And I remember when he passed away, in my freshman year in high school, I went to his funeral, and the pastor talked about what a godly man he was and everything. And that shocked me because he had explained he was in a satanic organization, and that he did not believe in God, and that his buddies and friends who were running he was an attorney and he worked probably for the CIA on and off for the rest of his life. He did work for scientists, mathematicians at MIT, and they created to pay him for his legal work. They gave him 2 file cabinets full of formulas, which he sold to Ken Olsen, and that became the founding of digital electronics. So the digital surveillance starts all the way back in the 50s. Their efforts to create the kind of digital panopticon that we're now facing with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and the crowd that has seized control of the U.S. government overtly. And I believe what's going to happen is they're going to Rubio's now the head of AID, and he's going to they'll just continue along. There's not going to be it'll be more privatized than it already was. And I think essentially what's going to happen is much of the U.S. government will be privatized and given to the PayPal mafia and the other hedge fund spooks and so on to operate as they want. And I think that Operation Stargate is a very strong indication that that's the direction things are going to go.
Very interesting. So I found that tweet here. I want to show this to everyone. This is from Mike Benz. Why was USAID funding the production of heroin in Afghanistan? See, this is the part I think people are not talking about. There's a lot of people right now that are speaking out against, Trump cutting USAID, and they're just talking about it from a humanitarian position. They're not talking about other things that the USAID does. And I'm going to show you exactly how much of that really goes to humanitarian aid. But it says here, U.S. taxpayer funds help irrigate, fertilize Afghan opium, funding Taliban. And then there's another one here, which says American taxpayer money has funded irrigation canals, farming equipment, and even fertilizer used to support unprecedented poppy cultivation and heroin production. So this is the piece I think, 2 things can be true at the same time. And I think this is the part that some people don't want to mention. It's good to have nuance about these sorts of things. USAID could also distribute some humanitarian aid, but that doesn't mean that is its primary function. And I think that's what some people may not understand. So to go along with that, sending taxpayer money to help cultivate heroin in Afghanistan, why is the USAID involved with that? So those are things that need to be said.
Yeah, well, you can see now, I feed the homeless. I'm in the homeless community all day in Santa Cruz. And so we had this huge camp, and you could hear people talking about heroin, before the U.S. left Afghanistan. And within 6 months of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, the conversation turned to fentanyl. And so one of the largest fentanyl arrests was in San Jose, in California, and it was, the fentanyl was being distributed all over the United States by the San Jose Police Union. So they're trying to give this impression that we're fighting this fentanyl that is coming in from somewhere like China or whatever. It's actually the US CIA and DEA that are organizing that. So if Trump is honest about, which of course this will never happen, but if he really wanted to stop the flow of fentanyl in the United States, he would just order the head of the DEA and the head of the CIA to stop flooding the United States with heroin. And we know, like back in the day, they had the Bloods and the Crips, and the CIA, expanded the Bloods and the Crips with crack cocaine. And then simultaneously, they make a law. Well, if it's powder, white people, maybe a year in prison. A black person, crack, 15 years in prison, right? So that's a Biden, crime bill. And so the manipulation of society by the security state using drugs as one of the aspects is ongoing. It's gone from World War II right to the present. So you can always thank the poor people that are suffering on the streets, on fentanyl for our government. In fact, I put up a poster around Santa Cruz. Somebody put fentanyl in little baggies of pot and left it around downtown. So I had 6 friends die that day. And so I put up signs around town, flyers around the community saying fentanyl, chemical warfare by the government. And then a person that was in charge of by the city, controlling the homeless, he virtually beat me up when I tried to put one of those signs up at the homeless camp. So I don't know for a fact what his role is in that, but there was fentanyl and meth going through the camp, and he was in charge of the camp. And this is sadly kind of common in homeless shelters and homeless industrial complex, that there will be like these marketplace for drugs that are actually facilitated by the staff. And so a lot of people don't want to go to, when I was I was jailed in San Francisco 94 times. I did 500 days in jail for feeding the homeless there. And I faced 25 to life in prison. I was the first white person to get the 3 strikes case. But when you came, you were allowed $27. And when you went from booking into the dorm, there was these 2 guys that would sell you crack for $27 when you walk through the door. Now, it's supposed to be a secure jail. But so this is like, this is not, the America is not what people think it is. It's run by covertly, and the things are manipulated. And that's why the left, the real left, not the phony Democratic left, but the actual left like us, we have a very difficult time. I'm writing, which could be seen on anarchistcook.blog later this evening, where I detail the basic highlights of the counterintelligence operations that I, first of all, learned about from my grandfather, the ones that I referred to at the beginning, and then my experience of facing the FBI, the CIA, Interpol, and so on for the last 45 years. And I've been honey trapped. I've had my mail taken. I've been smeared. I've been kicked out of Food Not Bombs forever, obviously I'm still in Food Not Bombs, but that was like I just ignored that. But I've had to adjust in the 45 years to the fact that my life is very heavily impacted by covert operations. In 1988, I was arrested the first time, the first 9 of us, on August 15th. And then the next week, the 24 people were arrested, and the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force showed up to observe that arrest. And on the 29th of August of 1988, they wrote a memo to the San Francisco field office of the FBI saying that we were a credible national security threat. Then that Thanksgiving, the National Guard all across America held workshops on domestic terrorism featuring Food Not Bombs. Then in 2009, I happened to be speaking at Harvard Law, and I just had spoken at Princeton, and I watched a C-SPAN lecture at Tufts University at the school, Fletcher School of Diplomacy, and a State Department person was comparing Al-Qaeda to the people that served the vegan meals in the parks. And if I had not seen this twice, I wouldn't have believed it. But he said that the people serving the vegan meals are much more dangerous than Al-Qaeda, because they could possibly convince the American people that money should be diverted from the military to healthcare, education, and other social services. So that's why, even in 1988, when there's only 30 Food Not Bombs people in the world, 10 in Boston, 10 in Long Beach, and 10 in San Francisco, that we are already declared a national security threat, a credible national security threat.
Well, I mean, it sounds somewhat similar to what happened to Chairman Amali Yeshitela from the Uhuru movement as well, right? Like people trying to help people. I want to show people this video here from James Lee, and I got to bring James on as well. People need to see this, because I see a lot of people up in arms like, oh my God, defunding USAID. But he really shows the numbers about where this money is going. He said, don't believe what US politicians and the mainstream media are saying about USAID. He's going to show you how much of this actually goes to humanitarian aid. Listen to this.
This agency is responsible for providing humanitarian assistance for millions of people around the globe, dozens of developing nations around the globe.
I don't think you should believe either of us. I think we should be asking the developing nations what they think about USAID. And this is what the president of El Salvador had to say. He says, quote, most governments don't want USAID funds flowing into their countries because they understand where much of that money actually ends up. While marketed as support for development, democracy, and human rights, The majority of these funds are funneled into opposition groups, NGOs with political agendas, and destabilizing movements. At best,
so everybody heard that, where the majority of the money is funded. Remember, the CIA has all different organizations or groups that they can use as a front. We talked about this before with Gloria Steinem. We were talking about how she was also working for a CIA organization. Listen to this.
yes, maybe 10% of the money reaches real projects that help people in need. There are such cases, but the rest is used to fuel dissent, finance protests, and undermine administrations that refuse to align with the globalist agenda. Cutting this so-called aid isn't just beneficial for the United States, it's also a big win for the rest of the world. Don't believe him? Well, here are the actual numbers. Some of the budget, yes, goes to humanitarian aid, but if you notice that it is second on the list after governance, aka meddling in the domestic affairs of other countries. And for
This is why I continue to say, guys, that once again, two things can be true at one time, right? So it could be true that some of this is going to humanitarian aid, but it's also true when you look at the charts there, it shows you that the majority of it is not going to humanitarian aid. The majority is going towards governance. So just keep that in mind.
And for those questioning the legality of shutting down USAID, I'm not 100% sure, so I'm going to just give you additional information and context to the organization itself. So President John F. Kennedy created USAID in 1961 by executive order. So maybe because this agency was set up through executive order, it could probably be undone through executive action as well. This next part is kind of tricky because it seems like USAID programs are funded by Congress, but the agency itself is, quote, subject to the foreign policy guidance of the President, Secretary of State, and the National Security Council, which also seems like what's possibly happening right now with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, taking over as the acting head of USAID. That's kind of where we're at right now. So if you're a constitutional scholar and you can offer some guidance there, we welcome your input.
Okay, so I want to ask you about this, Keith, because one of the things that Ilhan Omar was on Joy Reid, and she's one of the Congress members that has been speaking out very vocally about defunding USAID. One of the things that she said is that the president did not go through Congress and that Congress holds the purse, so to speak. But what we saw there from that text from James Lee, it shows that you can go around like Congress for this particular thing. Do you think that someone like Ilhan Omar, do you think that she's really aware of what this organization is doing?
I would assume so. I mean, I talked to people in Somalia myself who trying to start Food Not Bombs chapters. They're already freaked out by the U.S. involvement in their country now. So, you would have to be really dense not to know that the purpose of AID, just like the purpose of the National Endowment for Democracy or the Peace Corps, these agencies are specifically to further U.S. foreign policy interests and are often used. So like the Food Not Bombs kids in Kenya were working for Peace Corps, and they were so angry at where the food was going that they started stealing it themselves and giving it to actual poor people in the ghetto because they were just mortified that it went. So that food went to pay off U.S. allies in Kenya at the time to manipulate, so that the people that the U.S. wanted it to stay in power got the free Peace Corps food to feed a population that would then support them in the leadership of Kenya's agenda. So this is it's amazing that even 10%, the 10% that does help somebody is by accident. It's not part of the plan. And then you see, like when Victoria Nuland, first you see a pattern in the last 4 years. You see Samantha Powers shows up to Sudan. A week later, or maybe 2 weeks later, Victoria Nuland shows up in Sudan. A week later, you have a civil uprising killing probably 1 million people already, or maybe many more, because they had some geopolitical issue that they wanted to defend in Sudan. So this is just this endless pattern of this. I have this weird. I was worried you're going to ask me about this, but I will because I tweeted this too. But I happened to run a pirate radio station with there was this time where we had all these like pirate radio, 400 of them in North America, and mine was San Francisco Liberation Radio. So a friend said, "Oh, you should talk to this guy who ran the pirate radio station in Prague during the Velvet Revolution." So I become friends with him, and I go visit him in Prague, and he has a roommate, and this roommate is like trying to get me to go. I thought she was real attractive. We're flirting the whole time. She wants me to go to Bosnia with her. She's going to take pictures in Bosnia. I could feed the children, and her name was Samantha Powers. And when I see her now, it's a really creepy thing. So it turns out, then I'm thinking, maybe Gabriel, since he was running a pirate radio station trying to overthrow a communist government, maybe I was set up all the way along. And when I review my life, there's a lot of manipulation like that. So it's very possible that I was a guest of a CIA asset, and that Samantha Powers was not yet, a big deal yet. But that probably already at that time working clandestinely as well. And that would be a good way to get me off, would be to have another honey trap and go to Bosnia and get myself shot.
Interesting. And another thing I just want to tell everybody, if you want to feed people in other countries that are in need, you can do that without USAID. That's Absolutely. The thing to understand. You don't need to have that organization to feed people in those other countries. So after you've heard what Keith has just said and what I showed you tonight, like on the show, just keep that in mind when you hear politicians speaking about USAID as this great need that they need to maintain, and then question that. Because again, like I said, like a lot of these organizations, like from what I've noticed from my experience, a lot of times when you have all these politicians that are gung-ho pushing an organization and says this organization is great, it needs to stay, there's usually a catch to it. The organizations that are really out there helping people, and I mean like it's 100% going to the people and not going to overhead or to other entities, those organizations usually are not promoted by the politicians. And that's how you can tell the difference, guys. So just keep that in mind. Keith, where can people follow you to keep up with your work?
Well, the main thing is foodnotbombs.net. And there you can find all the chapters in the world. And we are feeding people along the Ukraine-Polish border. So we're all over the world. And then I have this blog, anarchistcook.blog, which will have this the newest post, but I have another one that might be of interest to people that's at the top of it right now. So yeah, foodnotbombs.net, and there is probably a chapter in your town, or you're free to start a chapter. So we are all volunteer. Each group is autonomous, and we are global. So and you're right. I mean, I was in Nigeria, met with the head of agriculture in Nigeria, and she pointed out that Nigeria was the one feeding the famines out in Niger and so on. It was farmers in Nigeria that were feeding other Africans. It was not the USAID, even though my father's best friend's wife was in the State Department in Lagos trying to undermine the government of Nigeria. And I when my sister got married, and I listened to the 3 days of her conversations before she went back to Uzbekistan to destroy that country. And it is outrageous what she said. She was an amazing racist, and she was in the U.S. State Department. And I was just shocked that we were sending people of her caliber around the world to destroy their nations. And that's direct experience listening to that. So foodnotbombs.net, that's where you can find us. Thank you, Sabrina, so much. So
Thank
beautiful.
You so much. Thanks for coming on, Keith.
Yep. Take care, everyone out there in
Bye.
podcast land. Bye-bye.
Hey, guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.